This wider lens, because it definitely is the biggest change in the Sony ZV-1 Mark II, but it's also the biggest problem. The Sony ZV-1 Mark II has just been announced, so is it time to get rid of the old faithful Sony ZV-1? Right now there is about 10 trillion other Sony ZV-1 Mark II videos out there. Some of the things that I've noticed about the Sony ZV-1 Mark II, which is really going to have you questioning, should you get rid of this? First up is the lens. It's a wider lens. That should be a good thing because everybody didn't like this lens because it was a 24mm lens. But if you got the Ulanzi wide angle adapter, then it wasn't as tight as people thought. And yes, it was all blown out of proportion. Just get a selfie stick and stretch your arm out a bit longer. Couple of things with this wider lens, because it definitely is the biggest change in the Sony ZV-1 Mark II, but it's also the biggest problem. Simply put, it's not as fast as this lens. So yes, it's 1.8, but when you start zooming out the aperture, yeah, those numbers start climbing. And essentially what that means is in low light, unless you're shooting at 1.8 aperture, wide open at like that 18mm, it could get noisy. Now, that's not the only problem with this brand new wide angle lens on the Sony ZV-1 Mark II. I'm going to get real confused. These Sony ZVs, ZZs, whatever names. The other problem with this lens, and this is the big problem, is this lens just isn't stabilized. Funnily enough, a lot of people didn't know about the optics in this Sony ZV-1, the original one, that was stabilized. So if you've looked at any of those videos today, the active steady shot, it just can't hold up. Sony stabilization has never been amazing. I'm shooting this in the Sony ZV-E1 and it's just okay. Sony ZV-1 is just okay as well. It's actually probably one of the better stabilized cameras. But because there's no stabilization on the lens, all the footage that I've seen today, it looks janky, it looks smeary. You're looking at those pain in the butt artifacts. So you are going to have to buy a gimbal. So when you do crop in and enable that active steady shot, does an okay job if you ramp the shutter speed up to like, I don't know, 500, 600, 700 or whatever, but then the footage looks unnatural. So what do? Yes, 24mm, then you're at 22mm, so the difference isn't huge. You're going to have to probably buy a gimbal, which is more money, depending on the type of stuff that you do. Did you know, if you're shooting in 4K on the ZV-1 Mark II and you open the screen, it's going to go dim, which means on a bright day, which on this side of the world we don't get too many of them, today is one of them, but you just can't really see the screen. It's going to be difficult to see, which adds to stress. Now, given that the autofocus is pretty damn good on the Sony ZV-1, Mark 1s, Mark 2s, Mark whatevers, probably don't have to worry about when you're trying to frame yourself. Am I left? Am I right? Am I in the center? Where am I? It can be really difficult to see. But the screen dims. Why does the screen dim? Because it's power hungry, because it's generating heat. There's one thing I really don't understand with the Sony ZV-1 Mark II, and this is a decision. I get it that this is a small camera, okay, it's tiny and it's really designed for travel and run and gun kind of stuff. However, they put on some extra bells and whistles onto the camera, new modes and all of that jazz. Don't worry, there's positives. I'll get to the positives before you make your decision should you sell this. But yeah, they have kept the old battery. This is even a Duracell one, the MPXB, whatever it is. And those batteries, they're okay, but you're asking the camera to do so much more. This is a couple of years old. It's the same body, essentially. It's the same sensor, new tech. The battery is going to do more. So all reports so far are saying the battery is lasting more or less as long as the ZV-1, the original one. That's really annoying, but you get my point. New technology, more features, can be more power hungry, so maybe they need to introduce a battery saver mode. But let's see when this camera gets into the public what actually happens. But just keep that in mind. Now, something else you really should keep in mind when it comes to the Sony ZV-1 Mark II, and that's one of the best features on the Sony ZV-1, the Sony ZV-E1, the Sony ZV-E10 is included with the Sony ZV-1 Mark II, but it's really limited. I'm talking about clear image zoom. Now, this is a digital zoom as such that works with the camera, and it just zooms in, and whatever jiggery pokery that Sony managed to do on an algorithm, it doesn't lose any quality. It's amazing. However, on the ZV-1 Mark II, as soon as you go past the 50mm, as soon as you go past and you go into that clear image zoom territory, the camera loses its ability to focus and track focus and all that kind of stuff. Probably keep you in focus, but if you're tracking something, it loses that instantly. While something like the Sony ZV-E1, which this video is being shot on right now, that holds that perfectly. Doesn't matter if you're clear image zoom or not. Something else that the Sony ZV-E1 has, along with the new Sony ZV-1 Mark II, is the audio sucks absolute. The onboard audio is not great at all. I wasn't impressed with the Sony ZV-E1 from all the tests I've heard today.
Now it should sound clearer.
So keep in mind, you are probably going to have to buy a mic for this as well. And something else that, well, the Sony ZV-1 Mark II seems to be stretched to the limit. It seems to be like pushed out, right? Maxed out, all the gadgets, all the tech, all the bells and whistles, even though some of them are limited. And they're limited for a reason: battery life, heat, dissipation, all those kinds of jazz, right? Here's the thing. Is this camera dead in the water? Will firmware updates just introduce stability, camera stability, that kind of thing? And that's it. Or is there scope for a firmware update to bring in 4K 60? Even if the sensor's capable, but the body and the camera, I don't think is. 4K 120, not going to happen. So something like the Sony ZV-E1, we're promised 4K 120 in the next couple of weeks. Let's see if that happens. But Sony ZV-1 Mark II, this camera, from what I can see and from my years of trying to understand cameras, it's maxed out. There's nothing they can add into it besides camera stability and maybe tracking focus on clear image zoom. Maybe. I can't see what else they can add to it. It's kind of limited. I know what you're saying. You're like, Vic, that's so negative, dude. Like, is there anything positive about the camera? Well, there is. It's got the 18mm wide angle lens, which is great until you start walking, but it is a positive if you have the camera on a tripod. It is a very wide lens, which is great. And if you want to go through the pain, heartache and suffering of stabilizing all of your footage in Catalyst Browse, then you can probably get a good enough crop and good enough stabilized footage. Then that lens is a positive, but I really struggle to say it is a positive because it's kind of at a sacrifice of a lot of other things. Something else it's got, USB-C port. So just USB-C port. Who has those micro USB cables anymore? But look, that's a positive, USB-C port, even though everything should have USB-C at this stage. Not sure if there's a fast charge in the camera. I don't think there is, but USB-C seems to be charging slightly faster, but it's just a far easier cable to work with, less likely to break, and it just fits. To their credit, Sony do listen to content creators, or maybe just designers should design camera bodies with half of a brain, because the biggest fault on the Sony ZV-1 was the tripod hole screw location. It more or less blocked the battery door. They've shifted that to the side in the Sony Sony ZV-1 Mark II now, which means it's far easier just to get the door open, your SD card in and out. That's all. That's another positive, right? Another positive for the Sony ZV-1 Mark II, and that's, I'm after forgetting what it is. Oh yeah, it's got all the gimmicks, cinematic vlog mode, which is fine if that's your thing, and it only seems to be the only mode that you can get access to a Cinetone from what I've seen, no PP11, but whatever. Like, if you're starting out, that probably doesn't make any difference to you whatsoever. So there are the positives that I can see. Now, should you sell your Sony ZV-1 and spend your earnings from that on the Sony ZV-1 Mark II? If this is going to be your first camera, it's probably a good first camera, but you will struggle with all the limitations that I've said. But still, it's a really good starting point. It's got 4K, it's got 4K 24, 4K 30, it's got 1080p 120 if slow motion is your jam. It's got good photo skills. It's a half decent, actually it's not a half, it's a decent sensor. It's got the mic port, all those kind of things. So it's a good first camera. It's an expensive first camera, but it's a good starting point. Just don't move around too much with it. Should you sell your, first thing I think when I see a new Sony camera, like, okay, I'm going to invest in this, and what I try and do is I, make a lot of videos on the channel about it, and that's part of my YouTube strategy, and help folks out get to grips with their new camera. And hopefully the AdSense money makes the money for the camera back. Isn't that right, Sony ZV-1, E1, ZV? Who fucking names these things? Anyway, it's a hard no from me. If you've got the Sony ZV-1, you have one of the best vlogging cameras on the face of the earth. The upgrades that they have made to the ZV-1 Mark II are limiting. The wide-angle lens is great, but it's limiting other factors in the camera. All you got to do is buy that Ulanzi wide-angle lens adapter. Boom. Get a cage. Then you can position the tripod wherever you want, and you can get the battery out whenever, wherever, however you want. So now is a great opportunity to buy the original ZV-1 because it's going to come down in price. People naively will possibly sell their camera, so you can get it at a cheap price than buy all the other accessories that I've mentioned. And don't get me wrong, both of these cameras are great, but the ZV-1 Mark II, hard no for me, my friends. And if you want to see what the Sony ZV-1 Mark I can do and what kind of gear and accessories you should get, video there.